In the early 1950s, Khrushchev and Bulganin appeared to be allies. After Stalin's death, the country was undergoing rapid change, and both men were trying to hold their ground in the new political reality. They had a common enemy, the old Stalinist cadres, and while the struggle for power was ongoing, they supported each other. Khrushchev understood that he needed a loyal person in the government to strengthen his own position. That is why, in 1955, he proposed appointing Bulganin as chairman of the Council of Ministers, that is, effectively, the Prime Minister of the USSR. It was a serious position, second in importance only to the head of the party. Bulgakov was loyal, disciplined, and did not appear dangerous. Khrushchev thought he would be able to control him from behind the scenes. But things turned out differently. In 1956, when Khrushchev and Bulgakov went on an official visit to Great Britain, there was an unexpected turn of events. At meetings with foreign leaders and in his interactions with the public, Bulganin proved to be much more confident and calm. He did not joke or behave in a simple-minded manner like Khrushchev, but maintained the image of a true statesman. British newspapers wrote about him as a man with an intelligent gaze and a firm voice. One Western diplomat said outright that if there was a reliable partner for negotiations in the USSR, it was clearly not Khrushchev, but Bulganin. Thus, Bulganin became popular not only among the party elite, but also abroad. He was perceived as balanced, judicious, even reliable. Khrushchev, on the other hand, was seen as impulsive, unrestrained, and unpredictable. Although Bulganin did not have an army of supporters within the USSR, his authority began to grow where it was particularly dangerous, in the eyes of the outside world. In Khrushchev's eyes, this looked like a covert attempt to remove him from power, and in the Kremlin, such ambitions were never forgiven. This visit was a wake-up call for Khrushchev. He suddenly realized that he no longer had a harmless assistant at his side, but a potential rival. Bulgakov may not have wanted a direct confrontation, but he began to take steps that were perceived as a challenge. Outwardly, everything remained calm, but behind closed doors, intrigues, investigations, denunciations, and secret conversations began. Relations between them began to deteriorate, but in public they remained a pair, party leader and head of government. It resembled a game of friendship, in which each was waiting for the moment to strike first. The paradox is that Bulganin had no intention of betraying Khrushchev. He did not even plot any conspiracies. He simply became too popular at the wrong moment. And in Soviet politics, popularity without approval from above is almost a death sentence. Bulgakov increasingly made decisions on his own, without consulting the Central Committee or Khrushchev personally. It was a subtle but very dangerous game. He was still sitting in the Prime Minister's chair, but now he began to behave like a real head of state, not just an executor. This became particularly noticeable in international politics. Bulganin began to correspond directly with Western leaders, on his own behalf, without the signature of the Central Committee, without consulting Khrushchev. These letters were not agreed with the party, and in fact violated all the internal rules of the Soviet government. For Khrushchev, this was outright disobedience. Khrushchev was not simply offended. He began to look for a way to remove Bulganin without scandal, neatly but permanently, and he soon found it. The goal was simple: to remove Bulganin from the political scene without causing a fuss or scandal. Khrushchev started with the most reliable tool, the KGB. He personally gave orders to check who was meeting with Bulganin, what they were talking about, and whether he was conducting secret negotiations with the party elite. Bulganin was put under surveillance. His phones were tapped, his offices were searched, and even his assistants and secretaries were interrogated. It was a real hunt, only without open accusations. At the same time, Khrushchev began to squeeze Bulganin out of key decision-making. He was no longer invited to important meetings, his proposals were ignored, and documents were increasingly signed without him. This was psychological pressure to isolate and break him, and it began to work. Bulganin began to behave more cautiously, but it was already too late. The most difficult moment came when he was summoned to the Politburo, without warning, without an agenda. He came as if it were a regular meeting, but found himself at a closed review. There, he was told to his face that he was losing touch with reality, exceeding his authority, and not in tune with the spirit of the times. Everyone understood that this was a show, but no one stood up for him. Bulgakov tried to speak calmly and explain his position, but everything had already been decided in advance. Khrushchev did not want to cause a public scandal. He simply created the impression that Bulgakov was an outdated, tired, ineffective leader. And it began to work. He became isolated. The intrigue was that no one directly accused him of anything, but the atmosphere resembled the beginning of the end. You are being watched, no one talks to you, your ideas are rejected, and at meetings they pretend that you don't exist at all. It was a method of squeezing people out, tried and tested back in the Stalin era. And while Bulganin tried to save face, Khrushchev was preparing his next move, a real coup. Bulgakov was not arrested, charged with conspiracy, or sent into exile. Everything looked neat, as if everything was done by the book. But that was the essence of the hidden coup. No noise, no blood, but a complete purge. Khrushchev decided to act officially through the highest authorities. Gradually, party newspapers stopped mentioning Bulganin. He was shown less often on television, removed from headlines, and then any mention of his activities disappeared altogether. When Khrushchev began to put pressure on Bulganin, the latter, of course, felt it. He began to seek support among those with whom he had worked side by side for many years, in the Council of Ministers, in the Politburo, among generals and old friends. But it was at this very moment that he was betrayed. Many were simply frightened. Khrushchev was gaining strength, while Bulganin was losing ground with each passing day. It became dangerous to support him. Therefore, even those who had previously called him a friend preferred to step aside or openly switch to the winning side. The most painful betrayal was the behavior of Anastas Mikoyan. He was not just a colleague. They had sat at the same table for years, working on reforms and discussing international visits. But when it came time to vote on Bulganin's resignation, Mikoyan not only did not object, he was the first to raise his hand in favor. This was a signal to the others. There was no point in resisting. Bulganin tried to reach out to Marshal Zhukov, who still retained influence at the time. He hoped that the old front-line soldier would not let him be dumped so easily. According to the recollections of his contemporaries, Bulganin asked for a personal meeting to talk without outsiders. But Zhukov refused. He simply did not want to get involved, so Bulganin was left alone. Neither the party nor the army nor the government took his side. Even those who owed their careers to him turned their backs on him. No one defended him. No one even tried to publicly stand up for him. In essence, he was not simply removed, he was betrayed. Khrushchev created an atmosphere in which supporting Bulganin became political suicide, and everyone understood this. By the end of spring 1958, preparations were complete. The Presidium of the Supreme Soviet was convened. On the agenda was the resignation of the head of the USSR government. Formally, Bulganin himself submitted his resignation. But he was not even invited to the meeting where his resignation was considered. The decision was made behind his back. Even under Stalin, such humiliation was unheard of. But the most interesting thing was who took his place. Khrushchev himself became the chairman of the Council of Ministers. In this way, he combined two key positions in his hands, party leader and head of government. And that meant absolute power. No one in the USSR since the 1920s had had such a concentration of power. In one day, Bulganin disappeared from the political scene. No explanations, no press conferences, no interviews. He simply disappeared, as if he had never existed. Khrushchev immediately began to strengthen his personal power base, removing anyone who had even the slightest connection to his former ally. In effect, it was a coup, only without tanks and rallies. Everything looked peaceful, but the meaning was clear. Khrushchev had subjugated not only the party, but the entire government. The USSR was once again in the hands of one man. After Bulganin was removed from his post as head of government, he was not allowed to retire peacefully. His career did not simply end, it was destroyed. And it was done in such a way that everyone understood. It was dangerous to quarrel with Khrushchev, even if you had served the state for decades and held the highest positions. Shortly after his resignation, Bulganin was given a new position, chairman of the State Bank of the USSR. At first glance, it sounds impressive, but in reality it was a formality. He was not trusted to make important decisions. He received all documents already prepared, and all he had to do was sign them. It was a kind of exile, not to Siberia, but to an office with fake powers. The most humiliating thing happened in 1960. His last official order was a document on the purchase of paper. Not on construction, not on financial reform, but simply on paper. For the former Prime Minister of the USSR, the leader of a great country, it was a mockery. But that was not all. After Bulganin's departure from politics, a real campaign began to erase him from history. His photographs, articles, and quotes disappeared from newspapers and magazines. Even in school textbooks, his name was replaced or removed altogether. For millions of people, it was as if he had ceased to exist. This was how the Soviet system cleaned up those who had fallen out of favor. Khrushchev did not simply remove Bulganin, he showed the whole country what happens to those who stray even slightly from the path of obedience. It was important not just to remove him, but to break him, morally and publicly. Bulgakov lived to a ripe old age after that, but he never appeared in newspapers or on public platforms again. He became a silent ghost of the Soviet elite. No one remembered that it was he who signed key documents in the 1950s, traveled on behalf of the USSR, and sat alongside the leaders of world powers. It seemed that Bulganin had been removed, publicly humiliated and erased from history. He did not object, did not speak out, did not give interviews. He lived quietly, did not interfere in the affairs of the authorities. But even in this isolation, people continued to fear him. Why? The answer is simple. He knew too much. Bulganin sat at the very center of Soviet power during one of the most dangerous and confusing periods after Stalin's death. He was there when secret showdowns took place in the Politburo. He saw who was making deals with whom, who was betraying whom, who was playing a double game. He knew how Beria was removed, how Stalin's system was dismantled, how new power structures were built, and that made him dangerous, even in retirement. Bulgakov continued to be monitored by KGB agents until the end of his life, not because he was planning anything, but because the system did not like surprises. Any word, any memory, any accidental admission could cause problems. Therefore, it was easier to keep him under surveillance than to deal with the consequences later. Bulganin never wrote his memoirs, not because he couldn't, but because he knew that such things could easily make him an enemy of the people again. Officially, he lived until 1975, but even in his obituaries, he was described sparingly and dryly, avoiding details. And at his funeral, there were no party delegations or high-ranking officials. Everything passed quietly, too quietly, for the former head of government of a great country.